If our last speaker drew on cultural memory to create public architecture that speaks the language of Chicago, our next speaker turns to a local tradition of technical expertise and innovation to create the next generation of Chicago architecture. Mark Sexton is a founding principal of Crack and Sexton Architects. With his firm, Mark has restored some major Chicago landmarks and created new ones. Crack and Sexton have overseen the preservation of 4 Mies van der Rohe buildings in Chicago, Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology, the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, and 2 apartment towers at 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive. The firm has designed the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership, Crown Fountain in Millennium Park, and the forthcoming 48-story office tower at 130 North Franklin Street. Glass and steel figure as primary elements in both the firm's new buildings and those that it restored. Here, then, is another path to design based on the application of historical precedent where historic forms are not necessarily represented, but rather become a point of departure for new forms and techniques. Please welcome Mark Sexton.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you to the Driehaus Foundation, and certainly with Richard Driehaus in the audience. Thank you, Richard, for this, this great opportunity, this great symposium. What I'm going to talk about, and I think the audience has seen this image a lot, I'm going to talk about first what the genesis of this might have been, and there's a lot of opinions, but how did Mies come up with this building at sort of a mid-career point, and then what happens in that building? I think there's 2. So when I say learning from Crown Hall, also learning in Crown Hall, and how it may relate to a project that actually we were doing simultaneously to the restoration of Crown Hall, and that is the Spertus Institute on Michigan Avenue. I'd like to go back, and again, I'm not a historian in a room with a lot of historians, but ultimately, what causes change? In this case, the end of the Great War, World War I, was an unbelievable event that no one had actually predicted, so the public was incredibly affected. But I think even more so, the artists and architects were affected by the destruction. And in fact, the notion that, that 4 years of this unprecedented destruction had really interrupted the continuity of history. And it had turned cities into rubble. So what was the path forward? By 1919, the German, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman Empire simply vanished. So what was happening to the world at this time? Massive change. And unfortunately, destruction and war was the catalyst of that change. So what emerged? Well, there was a sense of a new beginning. From the rubble, there could be the increase of civilization and the highest forms of intellectual thought. So in Europe, which had been completely destroyed in so many forms, they were looking to other places. In the US, the fascination with the skyscraper, with what had been happening both in Chicago and in this case by a Chicago architect in New York, was really fascinating to the Europeans, and especially the Germans, with the sense of structure and this new transportation element, which was the elevator. The sense of what was then the steel skeleton. Again, whether there's a debate whether it happened in New York or whether it happened in Chicago, and that'll go on endlessly, but clearly it was an American invention, and it wasn't invented because we were great artists and great sense of, you know, the uprising of mankind. It was purely an economic issue. It was just people wanted to make money. So with items like this certainly being published and being seen by architects all across Europe, but certainly in Germany, someone like Mies would certainly be aware of this. And in fact, inspired by it. So in 1921, there was a competition for a high-rise in Berlin on Friedrichstrasse. This was the submission that Mies had made. And certainly as a student at IIT, spending 5 years in Crown Hall, you were aware of this. It was one of the few history lessons you learned at IIT. It was not, but this sort of glimmering tower that had sort of a new sense of what a tower could be and what the materials could be. It is both reflective and transparent. It was, in some ways, showed almost the dematerialization of a building into light, air, refraction, and reflection. It was really a very interesting image of what the future would hold. The plan, maybe borrowed from Burnham with the Flatiron, shows a particular organizational sense. At the same time, Mies produced another image that we've seen again today, which is much more organic and free-form. But ultimately, what both of these images start to show is almost a complete lack of structure. Now, we've moved forward, and we see the sort of elevation of structure that Mies does later in his work, yet some of these first buildings, I'm struck by almost the complete lack of structure. It's really an idea, and I think that's where these drawings are perhaps most profound. Moving forward to the end of the 1920s is, we've seen it before, the Barcelona Pavilion, which again is an amazing building that appears on some level very simple and understandable when you stand in front of it and beside it, but as you go into it, it becomes more complex. You can see the plan here. It's a series of travertine plaza with pools sort of at either end, and what appear to be some form of bearing walls sort of enclosing the whole space, although the center of the space is very free with floating walls. Again, I'm not an architectural historian, but what I find interesting is if I look at the center area, that roof is indicated here in the blue, and if I take what could be bearing walls, I could support that roof very easily. So here in green, I've got what might have been the initial bearing walls, but then overlapping that is a series of 8 columns. So there's a bit of ambiguity that I think architectural historians have talked about a lot. What is the structural system here? Both are happening. And again, what I remind the audience is when you look forward to, let's say, the IBM building or certainly Crown Hall with the incredibly deterministic structure, here there's incredible ambiguity. And I think that's what is lost in a lot of discussions about Mies and his adherence to structure. You can see that overlap of both wall and column. Is it free space, or is it space that is open because of the columns? It turns out, for the most part, the columns were the supporting structure. If I jump forward very quickly to IIT, he's brought in as the dean, and his first building, which is the Mineral and Metals Research Building in 1942. You can see he goes from those free floating planes, both roof and line, and it becomes a box. And we've heard before about the structural expression of that box. This is not unique to Mies. This is actually unique to perhaps Chicago with warehouses. This is a routine way of actually doing structures for warehouses that Mies probably was aware of as he drove around the city. You can see here again sort of the open bay. Here's where he starts to become interested in what's called the poetry of assembly. He's very interested in how things actually go together and the expression of the purest forms of the material that goes into a building. An image or a study of a corner. As a student at IIT, you were certainly made aware of this condition. Here, the structure, the corner, how the structure actually turns the corner is actually a very difficult condition. Here, the steel turns and the brick is infilled. The brick is not bearing, and he expresses that non-bearing by exposing the corner of the brick, at least on this sketch. So he's trying to have clarity of construction, clarity of structure, and clarity of material. Second building in about 1945, the Alumni Memorial building. Again, this starts to become more clear, his structural expression and infill. And he wrote and said that the purpose for which a building is used are constantly changing, and we cannot afford to tear down the building each time. That is why we have revised Sullivan's formula, form follows function, and constructed a practical and economic space into which we will fit the function. This idea that Mies was trying to clarify his structural conditions certainly was a central aspect in his architecture at the time. Farnsworth House in about 1952. There were other glass houses. This is not the first glass house in the history of the world. However, in some ways, he was stripping and minimizing even more the structure and the materials that he would use in his construction. Here, there's really four materials. There is certainly the steel structure, both for the terraces and the actual structure for the house. There's travertine on the platforms and terraces and floor. There's plaster on the ceiling, and then there's glass as an enclosure. So he was reducing and minimizing the number of components that went into it, I think more and more as he proceeded. You can see here a plan. It's an open plan. It's got a core. It's not in the center. It's off-center, and it allows then the occupant to have different experiences as they trace around the perimeter of the house and use it. There's private areas, there's public areas, and it's actually, I believe, a beautiful construct of terrace and house all weaved into each other. It's white, as I've read, simply to be pure against the green and lush environment in which it was placed. In 1956, Crown Hall opened, and I'm going to get into a little bit more about what we did to resurrect parts of Crown Hall, but I want to talk about its influence. What happened in Crown Hall? This ends up being certainly a vehicle for learning, and it's right there. It's the teacher talking about material. It's the teacher talking about proportion. It's the teacher talking about enclosure and structure, and it's all there. It had a profound effect. It had a profound effect certainly on the campus. What was being taught in this building changed certainly the course of architectural history in this city. As we've seen before, Jock Bronson's incredible 1966 Civic Center, or now Daly Center. The points of that sort of expression of structure integrated into architecture so that the two are no longer apart. They are exactly the same, where you cannot tell the difference between structure and architecture and form. They actually, I believe, perhaps most beautifully realized in an urban condition with the John Hancock building. We were also part of it. When I say we, my partner Ron Crick, I did the furniture in this house, so I'm not taking any credit for the house. It was really Ron Crick and at that time his partner, Keith Olson, called the Steel and Glass House, completed in 1980. It took a lot of the ideas that had been taught in those 5 years in Crown Hall and became almost a thesis project for Ron. This was, again, taking the idea of minimal materials, expression of structure, the sacredness of detail, and brought them forward into this. It's simply, on one level, a U-shaped house. It was built in 1980 in a very, at that time, tough neighborhood. So the owner wanted the conveniences of a suburban house, which meant you could drive right in. You didn't have to use the alley, because the alley is what you'd get mugged in this part of the city. But at the same time, wanted the lushness of, so the security of a safe house, but at the lushness of a suburban setting. So the building has a courtyard as the center. It is fabricated steel. The language and the material that certainly we as students coming from IIT were really comfortable with. This idea of prefabricated steel brought to the site and fabricated. But ultimately what I think Ron did in this case was to take the Misesian language and push it forward in another generation, push it forward in a way that Mies might have done but didn't do, but it's an interpretation of what he might have done or what we learned from what he did that allowed us. So you can see how the central courtyard becomes the center of the generation of the living space. It becomes in many ways the heart of the house, with then overlapping rectangles on the top and bottom, which end up being bedroom and service areas, and then ultimately bisected by a line of light, of transparency that actually crosses the roof and traces down the front of the building. The attention to detail, material, and especially connection, where the bolts are all thought of and their position, both structurally, but as almost ornament and expressed pieces, are really incredibly developed. As was presented earlier today, the interlocking of the space. It's an incredible and very intimate space that allows the rectangles to weave together. So planes from one rectangle fly past the planes of others, creating this, I believe, very, very rich space. A space that is both warm, transparent, fulfills the objective of bringing the outside in and weaving it together in a way that is constantly evolving and changing, because the light, the green of that courtyard, and the clouds in the sky are all constantly changing. So I'd like to talk just a little bit more about our relationship now with Crown Hall, not as a student, but as an architect. I always love showing this. This is Mies, the happy Mies. You can see why there's not a lot of German comedians in this. But it's really a profound building. It's such a mature building. As you see, it's the full expression of structure. In this case, it's the first building Mies did that was exoskeleton, meaning the entire structure was on the outside. In this case, the roof is all hung from those major girders. Those girders are 120 feet in width. They're 6'3" high. They've got many steel plates added to it in order to have what is really a Herculean task of spanning that distance. There's exactly 4 of them. So it's very minimal use of material, although done in a way that all weaves together. You can see here how that roof structure then is a series of beams, and then ultimately that same language of steel is used. And the idea is using the least amount and the most precious of the material in the minimal way is what he was striving for. Could it have been done with a simpler structure? Most likely, yes. Would it have achieved the same harmony? I really doubt it. I think it's very difficult. The plan is open, in this case, completely open. Ultimately, the center of the building is a void. It's actually not where everyone goes. Actually, when you enter, you almost always go right or left. If you enter off the main porch at the bottom of this image, you always tend to go right and left, and the center is actually almost dedicated to its sacred, almost void space. At this point, you can see it at night and the expression of that plane, at the ceiling plane, and the image of the open space. And here, and it's been said many times, Mies said, it's the clear structure we have done, the best to express our philosophy. So this idea of openness and clear structural expression is really quite wonderful here. In 1956, when the building opened, there may have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 or 90, or I've heard stories of 120 students in an arrangement like this. I would say probably on module. And you can see it ends up being a learning environment that Mies thought was really a central component to his philosophy of education, is that everyone would learn together in the room. So as you went from first year, second year, third year, fourth year, and finally fifth year, you would see the progress of the classmen ahead of you and could anticipate your education there. Again, going from 120 students to the condition that I had graduated in 1980, but by 2004, it had been stuffed with students. It had grown almost 4 times, about 400 students were in that same, effectively, one-room schoolhouse. It had gone from a suburban lot-type condition to the chaotic image of a city where students are all on top of each other. Electrical demands are incredible. The computer, certainly in 1956, was not envisioned to be a tool for production in architecture, and it becomes one here. So the beauty and the rhythm of the building, again, in this case, its structure and its enclosure, 2 materials, steel and glass. The glass is manipulated a bit. There's the upper lights of glass, which are clear, the lower lights of glass, which were sandblasted to allow a diffusion of light into the space and some amount of translucency so that all of the work of the students wasn't flowing out to the exterior. In about 2004, when we started this, the building really had deteriorated, no longer had the clarity of that crisp construction and structure and materials. Half the glass in the building was cracked. It had been cracked for decades. Was the issue. It was quite interesting. The entire building was rusting. On one level, it was good. IIT never did anything to the building, so they never did anything wrong to the building, which is for restoration people actually very good. In our case, that was certainly the case. They did very little. There was, however, one restoration sort of from the time it was completed to about 2004. The existing glass, which is quite interesting, the existing upper lights of glass were 1/4 inch by about 13 feet, 12.6 to 13 feet tall. That's about the thickness of the glass in many of our mirrors at home. So that glass would routinely blow out in dynamic storms. After the restoration, I talked with one student, and he said, "Oh yeah, one of the pieces of glass shattered and crashed right through my desk." And I said, "Oh my God, weren't you scared?" He goes, "No, we just knew that when the storm came, you just moved towards the center of the building." I think that's amazing, given what could happen today. The bottom parts of the glass are 1/4 inch sandblasted, and this caused no end of trouble for the college because sandblasted glass is incredibly delicate. Just a fingerprint on sandblasted glass is almost impossible to remove. much less what actually goes on in an architecture school that has the largest backlit or light box imaginable. In about 1974 or so, the upper lights of glass have been replaced with 3/8 inch, and then the lower lights of glass have been replaced with what's called laminated glass, so the translucency happens between the two pieces. On a practical side, great, because the university could keep the building generally clean on the inside, but from a standpoint of how you actually experience the building, both exterior and interior, it became a problem because all of a sudden the inside, especially at night, was now reflective, which was a condition that was never really, didn't really happen. So we went around campus to try to find examples, because all the glass had been taken out of Crown. We tried to find examples of how it actually was, what it looked like. We went through a fairly long and arduous process of looking at different glasses. In this case, you can see 6 samples actually brought to site and installed to understand how it would react. The university, however, insisted that they would not live with this sort of glass ever again because they had a tremendous problem. It just basically just, it was a maintenance nightmare. This is not a caricature of an architecture student. I actually think this is an architecture student that is unemployed and becomes a graffiti artist. Because that's exactly how they use the space. They have no problem painting, gluing, and then the universal masking tape that sits on the glass for 4 months, getting baked in the sun every day, and then it tries to get removed. So we had to prove to the university that we could do it. So we got the benchmark sample, the clear glass, and we put all these things on the glass. We actually found a sort of a 3-part epoxy to move, to enable it to have a resistance of all the student activities and at the same time not change the character of it. And so we went through, you can see some of the installation here, but I want to talk specifically about one part of the building, and again, there's so little to the building other than, again, girders, mullions, and glass. I want to talk, here's a section of the building, the glass installed, again, those 13-foot-high pieces of glass on the top, and then the lower piece is about 8 feet by 5 feet. And I want to focus on exactly what the center part, which is, again, about 8 feet high on the inside of the building. It's where the glass stops and the mullion of the two pieces come together. And if we look at it closely, this is the original stop detail. I know a lot of you aren't architects, but basically the glass is held in by 2 metal bars and on either side and simply screwed in. This is a detail that Mies has probably spent thousands of hours developing. And it was central, and it occurred both horizontally and vertically in Crown Hall. So it was really a detail that was, a detail was the whole, and the whole was the detail. So back and forth it went. The challenge was the upper light of glass, even though it had changed to a little bit thicker, needed to get even thicker still to comply with the new codes of the city of Chicago. When Mies did this, I have no doubt that the university had no idea how experimental this building was, with its glass falling out and other things happening. So all of a sudden we had to increase that glass to ½ inch. So we had to double it. And so the real challenge was, how do you double it and still keep the essence of a building that has so little to it? The requirement was what's called the bite, which is how much the glass actually sits in that channel. It had gone, those pieces there are approximately, well, they're exactly 5/8 of an inch. And in this case, we had to go 3/4 of an inch. So it was a 1/8 inch problem. For you that are in the construction industry, 1/8 of an inch is never a problem, except here. It is a problem, and it's a very involved problem, because how do you change that? How do you put what is a required glass that has a 3/4 inch bite into something like this? And so Ron and I looked at it and had debates back and forth, and we said, well, ultimately, counterintuitively, it's actually pretty easy. We'll just put a slope stop in. That slope stop is now 3/4 of an inch. And we get our bite, we get our profile at the front edge, which is still 5/8 of an inch, and we thought that made sense. We made a model, full-size model of it. This was heresy in Crown Hall. The Mies police had a warrant out for our arrest. How could we dare put a slope stop in arguably the most complete rectilinear building in the city? And we said, easy, you don't see it. And so ultimately, that was a tough pill to swallow. At the same time, the slope screws, again, caused lots of problems. But ultimately, it was just that. You don't see it. We had to solve it, and that's where we believe design and historic restoration really have to marry. It's not simply following. It's finding the essence of what Mies might call the truth of the building and still holding on to that. So in 2005, the entire building was draped because it was high lead content, so we had to blast the building down to nothing. It was actually quite good. It was good because this is the first time, I've mentioned this before, the first time in the history of the world that OSHA standards actually helped the project, because OSHA required blood tests before you got in, and some of the Mies police couldn't get the blood test, so they couldn't go in and review the construction. So there is. So when someone says OSHA is terrible, that's not always the case. So we ended up blasting it. And then here, this is the image, I think, that for me, what I learned in the dismantling of it is the incredible delicacy of structure that is put in the building. That horizontal and vertical bar is so minimal, holding an enormous side of glass. And that attention to just how thin it could be was, I think, really the essence and the learning piece. You can draw this forever until you see it, touch it, and almost hear it. You have no understanding of how delicate it is. Into every life, a little rain will fall. This is an example of what didn't work. 2 weeks before the building is open, all the stops come, and they're countersunk too deep into it. For a school that I went, for a building I lived in for 5 years, where routinely we would talk about whether the slot of the screw should be vertical, horizontal, or 3/4 right or left, this was a travesty. It turns out we were able to work a little bit and ultimately open it up, and I think bring it back so the clarity of what the building is has been restored. So I believe the teaching that it can still put into the students or have an effect on the students that occupy it will remain and hopefully be reinforced by a living, breathing example of what this architecture is about. At the same time, as I mentioned, we had won a competition to do a Jewish cultural center in Chicago on Michigan Avenue, on the historic street wall of Michigan Avenue. The building that they occupied was right next door. It was closed. It was not transparent. They wanted to open their institute to the world. Basically, they said, welcome and learn with us. And their architecture did not support that. So they looked to us to develop a plan and an element that actually made that happen. It's a vertical building, though. It's on an 80-foot wide piece of property, and what we realized very early is that the building had to work like Crown Hall, but vertically. It had to be connected as much as that central learning space in Crown Hall, but in a vertical sense. So we started developing, and because it had exactly one facade of 4 exposed, we started developing sketches, and this is a wonderful sketch by Ron of what it could be. And the more we sketched and the more we looked at it, it was all arbitrary. It didn't matter. There was no connection. What was this? This was just pen lines on paper. It had no meaning other than just trying to come up with some idea. So here, what we did is we looked back at where we were, context. Now, architects from IIT are not exactly known as contextual. That's not part of the ingredients. But here was a perfect place to look at context. And what we looked at for that South Michigan Avenue Great Wall, when you hear the word wall, you think plumb and level. But you then look at it and you freeze the image, and it's anything but plumb and level. It's moving. It's almost vibrating, is what we found with these frozen images. The Railway Exchange Building is, along with the Auditorium Theater, two supreme examples of how other great, we believe, incredibly progressive architects looked at the same problem we were looking at. Why can't we find from them answers to ours? So we looked at a building like this, a great railway exchange. We looked at the bay, and we just analyzed it and said, what they were looking for, every one of those buildings was looking for the same thing: additional light, additional views, additional connections to what was and what is Grant Park and the lake. So we take this diagram and sort of take it and extend it. This is the rhythm of the building. This is the expression. This is the vibration I talk about and I simply just add a line, almost outline that. And I get this movement. And we said, why can't we take that same idea? Literally, all we're doing is finding inspiration from what's right beside us, take that, and maybe because it's a new century, look at a new way of doing the same thing. That's all we were doing. There was not sort of invention here. All we were doing is sort of colliding our century with the last. And so we said, could we make, instead of little ones, could we make larger ones? Could we make a bigger move because it's an institutional building on a very tight mid-block site? How does it have its own sense of identity? Maybe we go and we take that line and we develop it a little further, and then we develop a model of that. And for the historians here, this is actually how it really happens. We are groping. We're trying to find out. And this is the first model we made. We had no real idea where it would lead. We looked at it, did the model, and said, not so interesting. There was an obligation for us because we were on a historic street. There was nothing that said we had to do a terracotta building, a brick building. The materials were open. We had 3 criteria. One, it had to respect the street wall. We sort of understood what that meant. The second item is it had to appear vertical. Well, that was another issue because our building, we knew, was only going to be about twice as tall as it was high, and that became a proportion issue. And the third one is that it had to have a base, a middle, and a top. Those are the only 3 criteria of evaluation. So we started working on a base, middle, top. We started working on a verticality, and we come up with incredibly ugly things. But that led, and you see this then reflected in our other work as it starts to go forward. We start taking that and going to this. And we weren't doing drawings, we were doing models. And this is not 3D models, this is Elmer's glue and X-Acto blade models. And we started patching this together. Eugene Cha, who's in the audience, was one of the designers on this who made, you'll see coming up some of these models. And we said, this starts to convey, we believe, a new expression of exactly what Burnham was doing, exactly what almost every other architect up and down that street was doing, just in a slightly different way. And so we became very interested in this. We got a call from Howard Salkin, the president, and said, the mayor wants to see it, you've got a week. And so we said, oh my God, so we immediately did a rendering very quickly, and we said, this will never get approved because the city of Chicago won't accept this in their front yard. But as it turns out, just a couple of months before Millennium Park had opened to rave reviews, and the city all of a sudden had a new view that maybe we won't get into the kitchen with the architects and artists and muddle it all up and put pepper in their souffles and what have you. So they actually did, and surprisingly it was accepted, which which amazed us. It amazed us that Spertus would accept it, but secondarily the city. And I remember getting in I've told this story a couple of times, I got in a cab, as soon as we got the city of Chicago approval, I got in a cab with Ron, and he said, "Isn't that great?" I said, "Ron, that's great, but we have absolutely no idea how to build this." So this is just a series. Now this is where I go back to what I'll call the Misesian tradition of endless iterations. This is not unique to certainly our education or what we learned in Crown Hall, but certainly it was a component of endless searching for that perfect balance of proportion, material, edge, expression, transparency, translucency, and opacity. And you can see these are 6 of perhaps 30 models that were developed as we started to develop the form, ultimately ending in more models where we changed the material because we're interested in the reflection. And you can see here that ultimately what we did is we took this folded series of lines and transposed onto that a grid. And the grid actually was generated by what we started to see as the windows up and down Michigan Avenue. So the windows that we were part of would become part of the building. And so this overlapping of the two actually, I believe, is where there's an integrity and a connection back to place and back to context. So you can see that here. And then you can see sort of the components that go into it. We take it apart. We, in fact, even show it in 3 dimensions in this, and we're trying to figure out, okay, we've got its form, but how do we actually build this? And because of how we actually were trained, we had some confidence that we could actually figure it out. And so we continued with the form making, but ultimately we had to come down to the detail. What was the piece that actually made it work? And all of us in our office are really determined to get to the essence of it. The same essence that Mies was looking for his entire career, we would look for maybe this one time here. Certainly we would never compare ourselves to Mies, but we certainly had learned. In this case, so how do you hold the glass up? Well, this is a condition, it's called a mullion. It basically supports the skin because we really did want to have a skin of glass. But the problem was it had to be 2 places at the same time. So as it starts moving up the building, this conundrum expresses itself. And we actually draw it. We said, how are we going to do it? And what seems like, oh yes, we sat down in about an hour and a half, figured it out. Well, it ended up being about 4 months of figuring out. We actually, again, looked at that particular skin, and we wanted to reduce the expression of the skin down to just its element of glass, that it's a surface, that surface folds, and that as it folds, it very freely goes across the facade. So we developed this notion of we call it a Y mullion, and you can see here we call it the point of rotation. It's one component that gets used everywhere. So as it starts to be used, again, that I believe is something that we learned from Crown Hall. That one mullion that I just showed that went from 5/8 to 3/4 is used continuously. We use this mullion continuously. You can see how its element is really attached to the existing skin, the structure of the building. So it's very minimal, very efficient, and very, we think, very open and has an integrity of a new expression. You can see the individual pieces of glass and the skin and bones of that one facade going in. In this case, even the process, which we love, the process of construction is just a beautiful art where skilled people are they're part of your orchestra as you're working. Here, men are dropping this skin into the frame that has been so expertly developed and controlled. The caulking is done by, again, another level of skill that we love. So at the end of the day, we get this facade that we were hoping would be both part of the great Michigan Avenue street wall and also distinct from that, because it wasn't a building of commerce. It wasn't a club. It was a building of education. It was a building of open learning, and we wanted to really express that on the exterior. We wanted to be simultaneously part of the wall and distinct. We wanted to have an expression of a base, middle, and top. We wanted to do it in one material. We wanted to reduce it down to such a point that one material could give us all of those expressions. So what I maintain is what's promised on the outside actually has to be fulfilled on the inside. The outside is simply the face of the building. It is not the heart and soul of the building. So this particular image shows our idea of connecting vertically. The way we learned the horizontal connection in Crown Hall works, we were determined to connect it vertically. And the verticality had connection, and the connection was both physical and light-filled. So you can see from the 10th floor, the idea of pulling that light down into the floors below was sort of a central idea. So that as you entered the building, you had an understanding, an intuitive understanding of just where do you go and how do you go. The lightness of construction that was indicated on the outside, again, had to find its place on the inside with circulation elements, expression of components of the building. In this case, an auditorium that is by its nature an opaque element had to be expressed upon entering. Going back to our love of construction and the skill, really working with great Chicago craftsmen, as we just saw with Tom's presentation, working with these is such a joy, especially given the skill that we have. So here you can see sort of the attention to the most minute details in the process. An auditorium, which again, part of the learning space, very simple and light-filled spaces that flood natural light into the center of the building. Again, we only had one facade in which we could grab the light. In this case, it's brought into the center. The connection vertically now and horizontally to the space, so that you had an understanding and a connection, a visual connection to the floors below and the floors above you, as you can see here. And certainly its connection to the greater Grant Park and Lake Michigan environment. How does that transparency has this incredible connection back that floods light in. It's constantly changing the color of the space, and it ultimately creates these beautiful meeting spaces and spaces that people really congregate. At the end, it becomes a collage of changing transparencies and translucencies, constantly picking up the color of the sky and the Grant Park across. And I believe it starts to fulfill the obligation that we had to be part of that great street wall that is, again, part of the classical architectural order of the wall. We wanted to be part of it, distinct, and fulfill the overall objective of creating a new, in this case, educational and institutional building. And I want to end with where I started to some degree with Crown Hall. At the dedication in 1956, Mies started with praise of the president and giving him a key to the new Crown Hall. But he said at the end of his, again, very short dedication, he said, "Let this building be the home of ideas and adventure, real ideas, ideas based on reason, ideas about fact. Then this building will be of great service to our students and in the end, a real contribution to our civilization. We know it will not be easy. Noble things are never easy. Experience teaches us that they are as difficult as they are rare. And I would conclude that as we move into the future, I'm both haunted and inspired by such a challenge for continuing Chicago's great architectural traditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I feel like I've been inside Mies. You know those John Gunther books that came out between the wars, Inside Asia, Inside Europe? I feel like I've been inside Mies. And thank you for that wonderful tour of how you used precedent in creating the Spertus Center.